Yves slammed the car door shut, his pulse racing as the flashing cameras behind him grew more intense. The reporters were relentless, shouting his name, demanding comments about the scandal splashed across every major news outlet that morning. He didn't have time for this. He had to disappear at least for a few hours. His eyes darted across the street, landing on a small cafe tucked between two towering buildings. It looked quiet, ordinary. Perfect. Without thinking, he pulled his coat tighter around him and darted inside, the bell above the door chiming softly as he stepped into the warm, coffee-scented air. Behind the counter, a young woman barely looked up as she wiped her hands on her apron. "Welcome to Ivy's Café. What can I get you?" Yves hesitated. She hadn't recognized him. No widened eyes, no frantic phone pulling to snap a picture. Just a tired but polite glance before she turned toward the espresso machine. He cleared his throat, lowering his voice. "I'll take whatever's strongest." Finally, she looked at him properly. Her deep brown eyes studied him, taking in his expensive coat, the tension in his shoulders. Rough morning. "You could say that." She gave a small nod, as if she understood more than she let on, and turned to make his coffee. Yves exhaled, running a hand through his hair before choosing a corner booth, his back to the window. He could still see the reporters outside searching the street, but they hadn't spotted him yet. The last thing he needed was another headline. Billionaire Yves Laurent caught fleeing into Café after explosive exposé. A steaming cup landed in front of him, pulling him from his thoughts. "Here, no sugar, just strong like you asked." He looked up at her. "Thank you." "Iris," she supplied, before moving to wipe down another table. Iris, it suited her. Simple, unpretentious, unlike the people he was used to dealing with. As he took a sip of the coffee, he let his gaze wander over the cafe. It was small, a little worn down, but cozy. The kind of place that felt like home. A stark contrast to the sterile luxury of his penthouse or the high-end restaurants he usually frequented. Iris moved behind the counter, her brow furrowing as she counted the register. She let out a quiet sigh, rubbing her temples before shaking her head and getting back to work. Yves wasn't used to noticing things like that, but something about her exhaustion, the way she kept glancing at the register with worry, made something twist in his chest. "You own this place?" he found himself asking. Iris looked up in surprise. "Yes, well, I inherited it from my dad. He passed a few years ago." Something in her voice told him there was more to the story, but she didn't offer, and he didn't pry. "You run it alone?" "Mostly," she admitted. "I have one part-time worker, but it's just me most days." Yves studied her. She couldn't have been much younger than him, yet there was a quiet resilience in the way she carried herself. Like someone who had fought to keep her head above water for too long. "Why keep it?" he asked, genuinely curious, "if it's struggling?" Iris paused, a soft smile touching her lips. "Because it was my dad's dream, and now, it's mine too." Something about her answer unsettled him. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because he couldn't remember the last time he did something simply because he loved it. A loud knock on the window made him stiffen. He turned just enough to see a reporter peering inside, eyes scanning the cafe. "Damn it." Iris caught the look on his face, then followed his gaze. "You in trouble or something?" Yves hesitated. He should lie. But something about her quiet patience, the way she hadn't treated him like he was some untouchable figure made him sigh. "I need to stay hidden for a while," he admitted. She raised an eyebrow. Hidden from who? Instead of answering, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He slid out a crisp $100 bill and placed it on the counter. "If anyone asks, you haven't seen me." Iris blinked at the money, then at him. "You think I'd sell you out?" "I think money makes people do a lot of things," he said evenly. Her expression hardened. Without hesitation, she plucked the bill off the counter and shoved it back into his coat pocket. "I don't need your money," she said firmly. "If you want to hide, fine, but don't insult me by thinking I'd sell someone's privacy for a couple of bills." Yves stared at her. He wasn't used to people refusing him or standing up to him. For the first time in a long while, he felt something unfamiliar curl in his chest, something dangerously close to admiration. Before he could say anything, she turned away. "If you're staying, you might as well make yourself useful. We're short-staffed." He blinked. "You want me to work?" "Unless you'd rather hide in the bathroom all day." Yves glanced at the window again. The reporters were still lingering outside. He sighed, loosening his coat. He had faced boardroom battles, hostile takeovers, and billion-dollar deals. But working in a cafe, this was new. And for some reason, the thought didn't bother him as much as it should have. With one last glance at Iris, he rolled up his sleeves. "All right," he said, "show me what to do." Yves stood behind the counter, eyeing the espresso machine like it was an opponent in a high-stakes negotiation. The cafe bustled with afternoon customers, students hunched over laptops, an older couple sharing a quiet moment, a few hurried professionals grabbing caffeine before their next meeting. It was a world away from his usual environment, where deals were sealed over whiskey in dimly lit lounges or across gleaming boardroom tables. Iris handed him a rag and gestured toward the counter. "Start with wiping that down. Try not to look like you're plotting a hostile takeover while you do it." He let out a quiet breath, dragging the cloth across the surface. "You have a lot of faith in my abilities." "I have no faith in your abilities," she countered, pressing buttons on the register. "But you're here, and I need an extra pair of hands. Try not to burn the place down." He bit back a retort as a customer approached. A woman in a navy coat gave him an expectant look. "Grand caramel macchiato, extra foam." He turned to Iris, waiting for instruction. She tilted her head toward the machine. "Go on." Yves hesitated. He could negotiate multi-million-dollar contracts in his sleep, but this was foreign terrain. Still, he wasn't about to admit defeat. He mimicked Iris's earlier movements, pressing buttons, pulling levers. Steam hissed violently, and hot milk splattered onto the counter. The customer took a wary step back. Iris sighed, nudging him aside. "You're a menace to coffee everywhere." She remade the drink in a few practiced motions before handing it off with an apologetic smile. The woman took it and scurried away. Yves folded his arms. "I don't see why people are so particular about coffee." "Because not everyone drinks it like motor oil," she shot back, cleaning up his mess. "You're not a natural barista, that's for sure." He knew that should bother him. He wasn't used to failing at anything. But instead, he found himself watching the way she moved, the quiet efficiency with which she handled everything. She had a rhythm, a control over this tiny world she had carved out for herself. The door swung open, and a man in a suit strode in, heading straight for the counter. Yves stiffened, instinctively shifting away from view, but the man didn't even glance in his direction. "Iris," the newcomer said, voice smooth but edged with something Yves didn't like. "We need to talk." Iris's entire demeanor changed. The guarded amusement she had worn while teasing Yves disappeared, replaced with rigid tension. "Not here, Daniel." Daniel leaned against the counter, glancing at the customers before lowering his voice. "The deadline's coming up, you know that." Iris's grip on the register tightened. "I told you I need more time." Yves studied her expression, the way her jaw clenched, her fingers curled into a fist at her side. Whoever Daniel was, he wasn't just some casual acquaintance. Daniel sighed, shaking his head. "Time isn't something you have a lot of, Iris. You know as well as I do that once the deadline passes." "I get it," she interrupted, her voice sharp. I need to figure something out." Yves didn't like the way Daniel looked at her, like he already knew she wouldn't be able to. "I'll be back in a few days," Daniel said, straightening his tie. "Try to have an answer by then." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving the cafe thick with unspoken tension. Yves crossed his arms. "Who was that?" Iris exhaled slowly, rubbing her temple. "No one you need to worry about." "That's not an answer." She shot him a look, as if debating whether to shut him out completely. But then, as if a decision had been made, she sighed. "He works for the bank. They're calling in the loan my dad took out before he passed. If I don't pay it off soon, I lose the cafe." Yves absorbed the information, something sharp twisting in his chest. He had seen plenty of businesses go under, had even been responsible for a few acquisitions himself. But this was different. This wasn't just a failing venture. This was her home, her father's legacy. "How much?" he asked. Her eyes flicked to him, guarded. "Why do you care?" "Because you clearly do," he said simply, "and because I don't like the way that guy talked to you." She hesitated, then shook her head. "It's not your problem." He could have let it go, he should have let it go, but he wasn't built that way. Instead, he leaned against the counter, watching her carefully. "What if I could help?" Her expression darkened. "If you're about to pull out another $100 bill and act like you can fix my problems, don't." Yves huffed a quiet laugh. "I wasn't, but I do know business, and I know there's always a way out." She studied him, skepticism written all over her face. "And what would you get out of helping me?" For the first time in a long while, he didn't have an answer, because he wasn't sure himself. But as he looked around the cafe, at the walls lined with mismatched frames, at the small details that spoke of years of care and love, he knew one thing: he didn't want to see it disappear. And he didn't want to see Iris lose the one thing she had left. Yves had spent his entire career finding solutions to impossible problems. Merging failing businesses, restructuring entire corporations, negotiating impossible deals. But as he leaned against the cafe counter, watching Iris scrub at a stubborn stain on the espresso machine, he realized this was different. This wasn't numbers on a spreadsheet. It was her life. She hadn't asked for his help. If anything, she seemed determined to keep him at arm's length. But Yves had never been one to back down from a challenge. "Iris," he said, keeping his voice measured, "I know you don't want handouts, but what if I could help you strategically?" She didn't look up, and why would you? He exhaled, choosing his words carefully. "Because I know what it's like to have something worth fighting for." It wasn't a lie, even if the things he had fought for in the past had been very different. She finally met his gaze, skepticism clear. "And what exactly would strategic help look like?" Yves glanced around the cafe, taking in the details with a fresh perspective. The place had charm, but charm didn't pay bills. What it needed was foot traffic, visibility, a way to make people choose this cafe over the dozens of others in the city. "You need publicity," he said, "something that makes this place stand out." Iris rolled her eyes. "Right, let me just call a few celebrities and have them stop by." He ignored the sarcasm. "You're sitting on exactly what people crave: authenticity. Big chains all feel the same, but this place, it has a story." She crossed her arms. "And what, you think slapping a sob story on social media is going to fix everything?" "Not a sob story," he corrected. "A brand. People don't just buy coffee, Iris. They buy experiences, they buy emotion. If we can make this cafe feel like something people want to be a part of, they'll come, and they'll keep coming." She hesitated, chewing on her bottom lip. He could see the wheels turning, even if she wasn't ready to admit it yet. "I know people," he continued. "I can get a write-up in the right places. I can help you design promotions, events, things that make this cafe a destination." She let out a slow breath, and in return, he tilted his head. "You let me stay under the radar a little longer." Iris studied him, her fingers tapping against the counter. Then, finally, she exhaled. Fine, but if this turns into some corporate nightmare, I'm out. Yves grinned. Consider it a partnership. She shook her head, muttering, I already regret this. But the way her lips twitched betrayed her, just a little. The next morning, Yves arrived at the cafe before opening. The air was crisp, the city just beginning to wake. He wasn't sure what had possessed him to show up early, but something about this place about her kept pulling him back. Iris stood outside, arms wrapped around a to-go cup, staring at the faded sign above the door. It's old, she murmured, not looking at him. Needs repainting. Yves followed her gaze. Then let's repaint it. She huffed a quiet laugh. You say that like it's simple. It is. You tell me the color, and I make it happen. She turned toward him, her expression softer than before. You really don't stop, do you? No, he admitted, not when I see potential. Her eyes flickered with something unreadable before she shook her head and unlocked the door. Fine, but if you pick some ridiculous color, I'm blaming you. He stepped inside, inhaling the familiar scent of coffee and warm pastries. Deal. The cafe buzzed with the energy of something new, something alive. Word had spread quickly thanks to a strategically placed article in a well-read online magazine that Ivy's Café was the hidden gem of the city, a place where warmth and authenticity still thrived in a world of soulless coffee chains. Foot traffic had nearly doubled overnight. Iris moved through the space with effortless grace, pouring coffee, laughing with customers, and adjusting the hand-lettered sign advertising the cafe's upcoming live music night. Yves stood behind the counter, sleeves rolled up, handling orders with surprising ease. It had taken him a few days, but he had learned more than that. He had found himself enjoying it. You're getting good at this, Iris called over her shoulder as she pulled a tray of fresh croissants from the oven. I have a patient teacher, he admitted, handing a cappuccino to a waiting customer. Their eyes met, something unspoken passing between them. The past week had shifted something in him, something he hadn't expected. He had come here to escape, to disappear for a while, but instead he had found something real, someone real. Iris wiped her hands on her apron as the morning rush began to slow. She leaned against the counter beside him, exhaling a breath that carried relief. Can't believe this is actually working. He glanced around the cafe, taking in the full tables, the sound of quiet conversations, the scent of cinnamon and espresso filling the air. You should believe it, he said. This place was always worth saving. She turned toward him then, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. You didn't have to do any of this, Yves. You could have walked away. He reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face before he even realized what he was doing. I didn't want to. For the first time since meeting her, he saw Iris without her usual guardedness. She wasn't just grateful she was looking at him as if she was seeing him, really seeing him, for the first time. The bell above the door chimed, and a familiar voice shattered the moment. Well, well, hiding in plain sight. Yves tensed as he turned to see a suited man stepping inside, polished shoes clicking against the tile. His public relations manager, Victor. Iris stiffened beside him, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. Victor's gaze swept the cafe before landing on Yves. I've been looking for you. Yves exhaled slowly, his grip tightening at his sides. Not here, Victor. Victor raised an eyebrow. You can't stay off the grid forever. Your investors are restless, the press is getting desperate, and your absence is only making things worse. Iris took an instinctive step back, as if suddenly aware of the distance between their worlds. Yves saw it, the shift in her posture, the way her expression shuddered. He had spent days pretending he could exist in this space, in her world, without consequence. But reality had just walked through the door. Victor gave Iris a polite but detached nod. I assume you know who he is by now. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. I'll handle it, Yves said, his voice steady. Victor's expression remained unreadable. I hope you do it soon, because the longer you stay here, the harder it'll be to leave. With that, he turned and walked out, leaving silence in his wake. Iris turned away, busying herself with wiping down the counter. So, she said, her voice measured, how long before you go back? Yves ran a hand through his hair, frustration knotting in his chest. I don't know. She nodded, keeping her movements brisk, controlled. Well, I appreciate what you did for the cafe. You didn't have to, but you did, and I'll always be grateful for that. He could hear the quiet finality in her words. You think I'm leaving just like that? He asked. She met his gaze, something tired and resigned in her expression. I think you have a whole life waiting for you outside of this cafe, a life that doesn't include me. Anger flickered in his chest, not at her, but at the idea that she truly thought he could walk away from this, from her, as if it hadn't meant anything. This isn't just about the cafe, Iris. She swallowed hard, looking away. It has to be. He took a step closer, forcing her to look at him. Why? Because can't afford to fall for someone who's just passing through, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Because I've lost enough already. Yves felt something tighten in his chest. He had spent his life making decisions based on logic, on power, on strategy. But this was the one thing he wasn't willing to analyze, to reduce to calculated risks. Iris, he said, his voice rough with something he wasn't used to feeling. But she shook her head. Don't make this harder than it already is. He could see the war in her eyes, the way she fought against the very thing that had been pulling them together since the moment he had walked through her door. And for the first time in his life, Yves Laurent didn't have the right words. Because this wasn't a deal to close, a crisis to solve. This was love, and he wasn't ready to let it slip away. Yves stood frozen in the middle of the cafe, the scent of roasted coffee beans mingling with something heavier, something unspoken. Iris had turned away, her hands busy rearranging the sugar jars on the counter jars that didn't need rearranging. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to wanting something and not knowing how to secure it. The noise of the cafe faded into the background as he studied her, the set of her shoulders, the way her fingers lingered a second too long on the edge of the counter. She was trying to build distance between them, but he wasn't ready to let her. A customer called her name, and she moved toward them without looking back. Yves clenched his jaw, forcing himself to step away. He needed to think. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm. The world was waiting for him to step back into it, to return to the empire he had built. But the thought of leaving Ivy's cafe, of leaving Iris, made something in his chest tighten. He hadn't planned on staying. He hadn't planned on her. Yves pulled out his phone, hesitating before dialing a number he had been avoiding. A gruff voice answered on the second ring. About time you called. I need time, Yves said, cutting straight to the point. I'm not leaving yet. A pause, then a sigh. The press is still circling. You disappear any longer, and they'll start digging even deeper. I'll handle it. You're risking a lot for something that isn't part of your world. Yves exhaled sharply. Maybe that's the point. He ended the call before waiting for a response. When he stepped back inside, Iris was at the register, giving change to a customer. Her eyes flickered toward him, guarded. He wasn't going to let her push him away. As the cafe emptied for the evening, Yves found her in the back, wiping down trays. She didn't look up when he entered. He leaned against the doorway. You don't get to decide for me, Iris. She stilled, fingers tightening around the cloth. I'm not. Yes, you are, he countered. You think I'll walk away because my life is complicated, but that's not your decision to make. Finally, she turned, her expression unreadable. And what happens when the press finds you, when the world drags you back? I decide what happens next, he said firmly. Not them, not anyone else. Iris searched his face, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of hesitation, uncertainty, warring with something deeper. Yves took a step closer. Tell me you don't feel this, he said, his voice quieter now. Tell me you don't want me to stay. Her breath hitched, but she didn't move away. You make it sound so simple, she murmured. It is. She let out a soft, almost bitter laugh. Nothing about us is simple. Yves tilted his head. Then let's make it worth it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Iris set the cloth down, exhaling slowly. Stay, she said, barely above a whisper. And just like that, everything shifted. Yves had spent years mastering control. In his world, emotions were liabilities, distractions that clouded judgment. But standing in the quiet hum of Ivy's cafe, watching Iris breathe out the one word that changed everything, he felt something shift inside him. She had told him to stay. It wasn't a declaration, not yet, but it was enough. Iris turned away first, pressing her palms against the counter as if steadying herself. The air between them was thick with something unspoken, something fragile but undeniable. Yves closed the distance between them, his voice low. You don't have to be afraid of this. She exhaled, her fingers curling against the wood. I'm not afraid of you, Yves. I'm afraid of what happens when reality catches up. He understood that fear. He had spent years keeping people at a distance because his reality was relentless. But for once, he wasn't willing to let it win. He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. Then we don't let it. She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw something close to hope flicker in her eyes. It was enough to make his decision solidify. Before she could pull away, the cafe door swung open, and Daniel stepped inside, his expression unreadable. Iris tensed, her fingers slipping from Eva's grasp. Daniel's gaze flickered between them before settling on her. We need to talk, alone. Yves didn't move. Anything you have to say to her, you can say in front of me. Daniel arched an eyebrow, unimpressed. This doesn't concern you. Yves held his ground. It does now. Iris stepped forward, placing a hand lightly on Eva's arm. It's okay. Reluctantly, he let her go, watching as she led Daniel toward one of the empty tables. Yves stayed near the counter, his jaw tight as he watched them speak in hushed tones. Iris's expression shifted from wary to tense, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. Daniel leaned forward, saying something that made her eyes darken. A minute later, she stood abruptly. That's not an option. Daniel remained seated, his voice calm but firm. It's the only option you have left. Yves had heard enough. He closed the distance in 3 strides. What option? Iris hesitated, but Daniel didn't. The bank is moving forward. The final deadline is tomorrow. If she doesn't pay the full amount by then, the cafe is done. Eva's expression didn't change, but something inside him hardened. There has to be another way. Daniel shrugged, standing. Not unless you have a miracle lying around. Yves didn't believe in miracles, but he did believe in solutions. Daniel turned to Iris. Think about it. By this time tomorrow, it won't be up to you anymore. Then, without another word, he walked out. Iris pressed a hand to her forehead, exhaling sharply. Yves reached for her, his touch grounding. Let me fix this, he said. She looked up at him, something raw in her eyes. I don't want you to fix it, Yves. I want to save it myself. He understood, but this wasn't about pride, this was about survival. You have, he said softly. You've fought for this place every single day, but sometimes even the strongest people need help. She swallowed hard, her walls wavering. Yves made his decision. I'll handle it. Iris shook her head. No, can't let you. You can, he interrupted, and you will. There was no hesitation in his voice, no room for argument. For once, she didn't fight him. The next morning, Yves made a call that would change everything. By the time Iris arrived at the cafe, she found him waiting outside, a folder in his hands. She stopped short, wary. What did you do? Yves extended the folder. Open it. She hesitated before taking it, flipping it open. Her eyes scanned the documents, her breath catching. Her name was on the ownership title. No debt, no looming threats. The cafe was hers, completely and irrevocably. Her head snapped up. Yves, what? I paid the debt, he said simply, and I transferred everything to you, no strings attached. She stared at him, speechless. You. I told you, he said quietly, I don't walk away from things that matter. Tears welled in her eyes, and for the first time, she didn't try to hide them. He reached for her, cupping her cheek. I don't want a life that doesn't have you in it, Iris. A tear slipped down her cheek, and he wiped it away with his thumb. This isn't about money, he continued. It never was, it's about you, about us. Her lips parted, but no words came. So Yves did the only thing that made sense. He kissed her. It wasn't rushed, wasn't desperate. It was a promise sealed between them. When they pulled apart, Iris searched his face. You really mean it. He smiled, his thumb tracing her cheek. Every word. She exhaled a breath that felt like surrender. Then stay. And just like that, Yves Laurent, billionaire, strategist, man who had once controlled everything, let himself fall. For the first time, he had found something worth more than power. He had found love. And he was never letting it go.